Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Esther Kutash, and I'm the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. I, along with our partners at the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia, would like to welcome you to this lecture for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Before we get started, I would like to tell you a little bit about International Holocaust Remembrance Day and about our speaker as well. In Holocaust Remembrance, there are two major days of commemoration. International Holocaust Remembrance Day that always falls on January 27th, and Yom HaShoah, which typically falls in April. Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, first began in Israel in 1949 and was officially designated as a commemorative holiday in 1951. It falls on the 27th day of Nisan in the Jewish calendar and commemorates the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. This date specifically remembers the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. International Holocaust Remembrance Day was established by the UN resolution in 2005 and marks the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army in 1945. Tomorrow will be the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. This is a day to remember the 6 million Jewish victims, as well as the millions of other victims of the Nazis. For Holocaust education, organizations like us, we dedicate International Holocaust Remembrance Day to teach about how the Nazis targeted various minority groups and persecuted those who resisted their ideology. Tonight, we have a discussion about Martin Niemöller, a fascinating individual who has been remembered as the pastor who defied the Nazis. He's credited with the quote, "First they came for, and then they came for me." You're all familiar with it. This quote really became iconic. It's seen as a form of protest. It's included in news articles, museums, and memorials, and everywhere else. However, the complexity of Niemöller's character and his life is not as well known. While he's a great example of a capacity for change, he was initially a Nazi sympathizer. Tonight, we'll hear from Professor Matthew Hockenos, whose revisionist biography gives a much more complex and nuanced view of who Martin Niemöller really was. Professor Hockenos is the Harriet Johnson Toadvine Professor in 20th Century History at Skidmore College. He joined the faculty in 1998 and chaired the History Department from 2009 to 2013. For more than 2 decades, his research has focused on the German Protestant Church in the 20th century. His first book, A Church Divided, German Protestants Confront the Nazi Past, came out in 2004 and explored the question of how and to what degree the church leaders, pastors, and parishioners from 1945 to 1950 acknowledged their complicity in the Third Reich. His second book, which is the focus of tonight's discussion, is called Then They Came for Me, Martin Niemöller, the Pastor Who Defied the Nazis, came out in 2018. Professor Hockenos is working on a third book that will explore the history of the famous quote in further detail. Tonight's program will begin with a roughly 30-minute presentation by the professor, followed by a Q&A led by my coworker, Sophie Dawn. Sophie happens to be a former student of Professor Hockenos, so it will be nice to see them engage in a conversation during the second part of our program. If you would like to ask any questions, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom. And if you would like to support similar programs like tonight's event, please consider making a donation. We put the donation link in the chat. So now, without further delay, let's welcome Professor Hockenos. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you, Sophie. I'm very honored to be invited by the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation to speak to you on this very important occasion, the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you all for joining this event. Let me begin with a brief story, the story I opened my biography of Martin Niemöller with. On a wintry November day in 1945, a simply dressed, white-haired woman huddled beside a gaunt, somber man as they read a makeshift plaque affixed to a tree. The middle-aged German couple, man and wife, had suffered greatly during the war, and although the man looked particularly haggard, it was his wife who was close to fainting. The plaque itself was plain looking, a white painted board with black painted letters and numbers. The inscription, however, was anything but ordinary. Quote, "Here in the years 1933 to 1945, 238,756 people were cremated." Overwhelmed, the woman leaned into her husband for support. She was visibly shaken, knowing that he could have been one of them. Her husband was Martin Niemöller. They were standing at the entry of the crematoria at Dachau concentration camp outside Munich, where he had been an inmate from 1941 to 1945. Martin Niemöller said that upon reading the inscription, quote, "a cold shudder ran down my spine." But for him, unlike for Elsa, his wife, it was not only the number of people murdered that was upsetting. He was even more taken aback by the dates, 1933 to 1945. Dachau had opened in March 1933 when the Nazis began incarcerating their enemies just 1 month after Hitler came to power. Niemöller had been a free man at that time, a prominent pastor of an influential parish, and he remained at liberty until his arrest in 1937. Imprisoned in a Berlin jail and Sachsenhausen concentration camp from 1937 to 1941, Niemöller and other famous camp inmates were transferred by the Nazis to Dachau in 1941. He told a German audience a few months after he and his wife visited Dachau, quote, "My alibi accounted for the years 1937 to 1945. But God was not asking me where I had been from 1937 to 1945, but from 1933 to 1945. And for those earlier years, I did not have any answer." This revelatory moment at Dachau and the feelings of shame and guilt that it surely prompted gave rise to his famous confession. First, the Nazis came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. In the year following their visit to Dachau, Niemöller recited non-poetic versions of the confession to his German compatriots, modeling for them how to admit to and repent one's complacency toward and complicity in the Nazi era and the Holocaust. The popularity of what is now known as the Niemöller Confession, or the Niemöller poem, spread in the United States at the time of the McCarthy Red Scare in the 1940s and 50s, and in the late 1970s and early 1980s with the rise of the human rights movement. Today, it is frequently invoked by many kinds of activists and prominently displayed at Holocaust memorials in the US and Europe. For American liberals and progressives, Niemöller is a progressive icon. While it's becoming commonplace in the past 2 decades to enlist Niemöller and his poem as cultural symbols for fighting oppression and standing up for the persecuted, it might come as a surprise to many contemporary Americans that long before the quotation became famous in the 21st century, Pastor Niemöller himself was a luminary in mid-20th century America. And it wasn't just white Protestant churchgoers singing his praise. From the 1930s to the 1980s, an extraordinary array of American individuals and institutions expressed reverence for his alleged defiance of Hitler and his faith-based activism after the Second World War. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, civil rights icon Martin Luther King, and Black Panther leader Bobby Seale all extolled his courage and activism. The German Gandhi, the fighting pastor, the modern Luther, and the pastor who defied the Nazis are just some of the reverential titles bestowed on the German Lutheran pastor during his life. From the perspective of a German historian, especially one who focuses on German Protestantism, and Martin Niemöller in particular, all of these accolades are puzzling because there is another side to Niemöller that many people are not familiar with. Born in 1892, Niemöller grew up during the German monarchy's struggle for world recognition. He served proudly as a submarine officer in Kaiser Wilhelm II's Imperial Navy in World War I, earned an Iron Cross in 1917. After the war, and the Social Democratic Revolution that overthrew the German monarchy, Niemöller joined extreme right-wing paramilitary groups that fought against the Democratic Republic. In some regions of Germany, a civil war broke out, with Niemöller commanding a battalion of right-wing veterans against the leftists. Unwilling to serve the new democratic government, he resigned from the Navy and began attending seminary school in the 1920s. Ordained a Lutheran pastor in 1924, he remained an arch-conservative during Germany's short-lived liberal republic, the so-called Weimar Republic. After reading Mein Kampf in 1931, Niemöller cast his ballot for the Nazis in 1933, the year the Nazis came to power. Niemöller was silent when Hitler's stormtroopers beat communists, socialists, and Jews, hauling them off to concentration camps. He was silent because he believed that these groups were disloyal to Germany and anti-Christian. Since 1931, Niemöller lived in a very wealthy suburb of Berlin called Dahlem, where he led a congregation that included German political and military and economic leaders. If Niemöller's parishioners wondered, was it possible to be a good Christian and a good Nazi at the same time, the answer would have been clear. Excuse me, I'm nursing a cold. Niemöller made no secret of his support for the Nazis. Although he never campaigned explicitly for Hitler from the pulpit, Niemöller saw no contradiction at this stage in calling on his flock to follow a merciful God while at the same time supporting the Nazi leader who demanded absolute political loyalty. German Protestants, Niemöller believed, could and should do both. After all, they had revered the alliance of throne and altar for centuries. It wasn't a great leap from there to the alliance of the Nazi Party and the Protestant Church. When Hitler was appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933, Niemöller responded with enthusiasm. The new chancellor spoke frequently about the vital role the churches would play in the reborn Germany. The Nazis were committed to what they called positive Christianity and to battling the Jewish materialistic spirit. After assuming power, Hitler reassured the nation that the government would protect Christianity as the basis of our entire morality and fill our culture again with the Christian spirit. All of this was most welcome to conservative Protestants like Niemöller. Hitler's appointment, they convinced themselves, would usher in the hour of the church, God's hour. They anticipated that the churches, which had been gradually losing attendance for a century, would soon fill again. Many Protestant pastors joined the Nazi Party, eager to participate in the movement for one nation, one people, one church, including Pastor Wilhelm Niemöller, Martin's younger brother. Although Martin Niemöller never became a Nazi Party member himself, his sermons during this period were rife with references to the dual awakenings of nation and church. The Nazi Revolution, he believed, would restore Christianity to its rightful place in the public life of the nation. In one of these sermons, Niemöller took up the question of the proper role of Christians in politics. He said, "The fact is, it is simply impossible for us today to accept the comfortable formula that politics have no place in the church." Political events, he maintained, were of great importance to our fate and to that of our nation. And he encouraged his parishioners to take a conscientious stand this very day. The date of the sermon, March 5th, 1933, is significant. That day saw the first and only election in Nazi Germany. Niemöller took his conscientious stand by voting for the Nazis. Hitler's totalitarian approach to governing left no room for alternative outlooks or independent organizations and institutions. Immediately after assuming power, Hitler banned all political parties except the Nazi Party and began the process of Nazifying all of German society and its institutions, the military, the courts, the schools, the police, the civil service, and the economy. What Niemöller didn't expect, however, was that Hitler also wanted to Nazify the Protestant church. The rowdies in the Nazi Party, Hitler's base, attacked traditional Christianity, mocking its allegedly weak, crucified God, and advocating in its place an Aryan Christianity that worshipped a powerful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, manly Jesus. As the Nazis grew in popularity, a group of fervent Nazi supporters emerged in the Protestant church, calling themselves the German Christian movement. The German Christians believed that Nazism and Christianity were mutually reinforcing. As Nazi enthusiasts, they were anti-Semitic, but in a uniquely religious way. They denied the Jewish ancestry of Jesus and wanted to purge German Protestantism of everything associated with Judaism, including the Old Testament. Their goal was a racially pure church that excluded anyone with Jewish ancestry, even baptized Christians. As far as the German Christians were concerned, converts from Judaism to Christianity remained biologically non-Aryan and therefore were not welcome in the church. One particularly offensive German Christian slogan, "Baptism can't straighten out a hooked nose," conveys the priority of race over God's grace in German Christian thinking. Niemöller had strong reservations about the idea of Aryan Christianity and drew a thick line between his conservative nationalist Protestantism and the German Christians' racial Protestantism. Although the two groups shared a commitment to conservatism, nationalism, anti-communism, and anti-Semitism, there were significant differences between them. Traditional Protestants rejected a racial litmus test for membership in the church. They defended the Old Testament and the Jewish origins of Jesus, and they took offense at the blatant politicizing of Christianity. By twisting the cross to resemble a swastika, the German Christians won over many Nazis to the church, but also alienated many conservatives, Niemöller among them. Niemöller's disapproval of the German Christians was the starting point for his eventual opposition to Hitler's church policy, which favored the German Christians over the traditionalists. The night before nationwide church elections in July 1933, Hitler took to the airwaves to promote the German Christian movement. It was this intrusion into church affairs and Nazi attacks on the Old Testament that sparked Niemöller's opposition. A stubborn Westphalian by nature and a skilled manager and administrator since his days as a naval officer, Niemöller took command of the Protestant church's opposition to Hitler's repressive church policy. Niemöller could no longer sustain the belief that Hitler wanted to rule in partnership with the Protestant church. In the aftermath of the church elections, Niemöller openly criticized the state's intervention. As the struggle for control of the churches intensified, Niemöller founded the Pastors' Emergency League, or PEL. Members signed a pledge stating their opposition to German Christian heresies, declaring, quote, "I pledge myself to exercise my office as a servant of the Word, under the sole authority of Holy Scripture and the Reformation confessions, as the correct interpretation of Holy Scripture," end quote. Through sermons, circular letters, articles in church periodicals, and protests, Niemöller and the PEL leadership, even as the nationalists among them fell into line with other aspects of the Nazi program, were mounting an organized resistance to the German Christian movement. As word spread in the US print media and American church circles of Niemöller's defiance of Hitler and his leadership of the oppositional Pastors' Emergency League, his stature reached dizzying heights. Niemöller became the face of the resistance in the United States. Between 1933 and 1945, the New York Times reported on Niemöller's opposition in over 375 articles. Although the reporting became more accurate over time, the media often fanned the flames of Niemöller mania in many subtle and not so subtle ways. A case in point is the press and commentary around Niemöller's supposed opposition to anti-Semitism. Under dramatic headlines from 1933 declaring, "Hitlerites fire Nazi pastor for defending Jews," and the church ousts Berlin pastor for fighting anti-Semitism, Americans followed the dramatic events of the founding of the oppositional Pastors Emergency League and eventually the Confessing Church under Niemöller's leadership. A casual reader of these headlines could easily conclude that Niemöller was anti-Nazi and an opponent of anti-Semitism, mistaking his opposition to the German Christians and Hitler's church policy as resistance to Nazism and Hitler's racial policies. In fact, Niemöller limited his opposition to fighting racial discrimination directed against Christians of Jewish descent who held positions in the church, not prejudice against Jews themselves. Over time, the reporting became clearer in explaining this, but these subtleties were lost on many Americans who believed simply that Niemöller was an all-out opponent of Nazism and everything it stood for. Given this type of coverage, few Americans would have correctly identified Niemöller's politics and that of the Protestant church as anti-democratic, nationalist, and anti-Semitic. Americans would have been shocked by Dietrich Bonhoeffer's 1933 description of Niemöller and his type as naive, starry-eyed idealists who thought that they were the real National Socialists because of their dual devotion to Nazism and national Protestantism. Bonhoeffer wasn't the only one who wasn't duped. Some Jewish and Protestant periodicals in the US reported on the failure of German Protestants to take a stand against anti-Semitism. During the first week of February 1933, rabbis across the US railed against Hitler's appointment and the surge of anti-Jewish persecution that followed. They pledged their support for their brethren in Germany and repeatedly called upon American political and religious leaders to denounce Nazi anti-Semitism. The Protestant Federal Council of Churches in America, the FCC, followed this request with a strong condemnation of Nazi anti-Semitism and called on German Protestants to do the same. They did not. What the Niemöller faction protested in 1933 was not anti-Semitism per se, but the attempt by the German Christians, the so-called stormtroopers of Christ, to impose racial criteria on pastors in the Protestant church. This racial litmus test touted by the German Christians was known as the Aryan Clause or Aryan paragraph. They wanted the couple dozen pastors with Jewish heritage, perhaps they had a Jewish parent or grandparent, to be removed from the pulpit. The Niemöller opposition rejected the Aryan Clause because it called into question the efficacy of the sacrament of baptism. The Protestant pastors of Jewish descent were baptized Christians. Their faith in Christ, Niemöller argued, could not be overridden by racial heritage. As courageous as it was to call out the heresies of the Hitler-backed German Christians, the Niemöller-led opposition remained silent in 1933, 1934, and 1935 on anti-Semitism toward Jews. It took the Niemöller opposition 3 years to remedy this omission with its 1936 memorandum to Hitler, the primary purpose of which was to criticize Hitler's de-Christianization campaign. In this 5-page statement, there appeared a short but strong condemnation of Nazi anti-Semitism when it was imposed on a Christian. This is the short paragraph, I'll quote from it. When anti-Semitism, which binds one to hatred of Jews, is imposed upon the Christian, in the framework of the National Socialist worldview, then the Christian commandment to love one's fellow human stands opposed to it, end quote. These words are often taken as proof that Niemöller and the Confessing Church resisted the regime's racial policy. But the larger record of Niemöller and the Confessing Church cannot be ignored. A few exceptions aside, and Niemöller was not one of them, confessing pastors responded to the persecution of Jews neither as humanitarians nor as religious brethren, sharing a Judeo-Christian tradition. They remained concerned first and foremost with the persecution of the churches. And while the memorandum called on Christians to counter Nazi hatred towards Jews by following the commandment to love one's neighbor, it had nothing to say about the church's theological anti-Judaism that charged Jews with the crucifixion of Christ, which was itself a key driver of anti-Semitism. Niemöller's defense of Jews was certainly lacking, but his defiance of Hitler's attempts to Nazify the Protestant church was unrelenting and eventually led to several arrests and suspensions between 1933 and 1937. By 1937, Hitler had had enough. On July 1st, he ordered Niemöller's arrest and imprisonment. In his final sermon on June 27th, 1937, Niemöller proclaimed, quote, "When God calls on us to preach the word of the Lord, we must obey God rather than man," end quote. The American Federal Council of Churches reacted to his arrest by calling on Protestant churches to hold special prayer vigils and ring church bells. Throughout his 8 years of captivity, American Protestants were urged to commemorate various Niemöller anniversaries, his birthday, the original date of his arrest, his rearrest, etc. His many admirers extolled him as the modern Luther, who stood up to Hitler by allegedly proclaiming to Hitler, "Not you, Herr Hitler, not you, Herr Hitler, but God is my Führer." His religious-based opposition clearly struck a chord with American churchgoers. But it wasn't just Protestants riding the Niemöller wave. Since he was often portrayed as a defender of the Jews and freedom in general, many Jews, Catholics, African Americans, and secular liberals all venerated him. In 1938, the Chicago Rabbinical Association distributed to its members a special prayer for Pastor Niemöller. It read in part, quote, "At this very moment, the lash is falling upon one who has had the courage and the character to rebel and to fight for that which is symbolic of freedom of this day. Pastor Martin Niemöller is fighting civilization's cause," end quote. In July 1939, the leftist periodical, The Nation, described Niemöller as the symbol of the struggle against Nazism and urged anti-fascist forces in the United States to honor his resistance. Amid all this praise, however, there were disturbing reminders of his nationalism and Christian anti-Semitism, leading some to qualify their praise. Samuel Volkmann, a rabbi in Chicago, for instance, took aim at Niemöller's anti-Semitism, a topic rarely discussed in the American press. In reference to a book of Niemöller's sermons titled "God is my Führer," in which Niemöller referred to the eternal Jew, Volkmann asked, "Who but the bigot will deny that this is as malevolent as it is unjust?" End quote. Niemöller's decision at the outbreak of the Second World War, at this point he's in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, his decision to volunteer his services to the German Navy to fight for his fatherland in World War II also raised some eyebrows. Although the Nazi authorities turned him down and he stayed in the concentration camp, his willingness to serve confused those who exalted his record of resistance against the Nazis. The American public on the whole was not especially perturbed. On December 23rd, 1940, Niemöller's image appeared on the cover of Time magazine with the headline, martyr of 1940. In Germany, only the cross has not bowed to the swastika, end quote. Niemöller was the subject of repeated articles by the mainstream and religious press throughout his incarceration. A movie, Pastor Hall, based on the life of Niemöller, premiered in Philadelphia in August 1940. Popular biographies, such as Basil Miller's Martin Niemöller, Hero of the Concentration Camp, and Leo Stein's I Was in Hell with Martin Niemöller, exalted his piety and courage. Hitler may break his back, but never his soul, Miller proclaimed. As the end of the war approached, advertisements appeared in newspapers proclaiming, "He won't Heil Hitler, so Reverend Martin Niemöller begins his 7th year in a German prison camp. Remember Martin Niemöller." Niemöller served 8 years in Hitler's camps. The decade from 1945 to 1955 was a decade of transformation for Martin Niemöller. During this period, he came to embrace new theological principles and political ideas that are not usually associated with German Lutheranism. He rejected the Zwei-Reiche-Lehre, the doctrine of 2 kingdoms, and championed a political role for the church. He abandoned German nationalism and became a leader of the ecumenical movement. And he denounced war and the remilitarization of Germany and gradually came to adopt pacifism. Niemöller led a faction in the post-war church that demanded that the church admit to its errors during the Nazi period, express remorse, and openly repent their guilt. He helped author the famous Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt in October 1945 that stated, "We accuse ourselves for not witnessing more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, for not believing more joyously, and for not loving more ardently. By our passivity, endless suffering was experienced by many people and countries," end quote. For 12 months, from November 1945 to November 1946, Niemöller crisscrossed Germany, preaching the message of guilt and repentance, frequently invoking his own passivity from 1933 to 1937 as an example. It was during this speaking tour that we see the origins of his famous confession, "First they came for the communists." Another prominent message of his post-war sermons was the need for the church to play a role in public affairs, in Germany in particular, and in the world more generally. Niemöller lamented that since the secularizing efforts of the French Revolution, religion had become a private affair in Western and Central Europe. Public matters were not guided by morality, and citizens did not feel a sense of moral responsibility. The absence of the 10 Commandments from public life, he suggested, led people to embrace demagogues who seemed to have all the answers. He made clear that the confessing church had learned its lessons. When I came home from the camps, I found a different church than I had seen before my imprisonment. I found a church in which Jesus Christ had worked for 8 years and in which he had regained his place as master and as Lord. Niemöller told theology students at Boston University in the mid-1950s, quote, "The danger of the church in the present situation lies in the fact that she may retire into her purely religious mission," end quote. In the past, he explained, the church gave a free hand to the secular authority in political matters, which left people without Christian counsel or guidance in these matters. Quote, "The church has to become the conscience of the political powers, reminding politicians of the limitations of their authority," end quote. This wasn't just the task of the organized church, but also of everyday Christians in their roles as judges, politicians, industrialists, workers, and businessmen. And he might have added pastors. As he saw it, all Christians had to demonstrate Christian responsibility in their public life and demand it of their leaders. He always provided a religious explanation for his political arguments, often pointing to the Sermon on the Mount or another example in the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Niemöller's political pronouncements, no matter that he had grounded them in faith, elicited rebuke after rebuke from fellow churchmen, especially the conservative Lutheran faction in the post-war German church, who believed that the job of a church leader was to preach the gospel and administer church affairs, not offer advice to the West German chancellor. The conservative Lutherans, Niemöller didn't hesitate to point out, were as politically engaged as he was, the only difference being they supported the West in the Cold War. By 1954, Niemöller was not just preaching neutrality in the Cold War, but was openly declaring his pacifism. In a lecture called The Way of Peace, he asserted that when Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers I have come to see," he really meant it. It is not just a pious and nice-sounding phrase. I do not see in the New Testament any encouragement for the use of force, end quote. Soon after, he became the president of the German Peace Society, which was founded in 1892 as the first pacifist organization in Germany. From 1954 on, Niemöller made it his primary goal to expand the circle of pacifists person by person through education and example. Just as his pacifist colleagues had slowly reeled him in through conversations and dialogue, he traveled the globe, frequently visiting communist nations, preaching the way of nonviolence, extolling Gandhi, and reminding anyone who would listen that we live either in one world or a world with no future. This middle-class conservative Protestant who had harbored ingrained prejudices against those not like him, who read Mein Kampf and then voted for the Nazis, did something excruciatingly difficult for someone of his background. He changed his mind. On his 90th birthday in 1982, Niemöller joked that he had started his political career as an ultra-conservative who loyally served the Kaiser. Now he was a revolutionary, he said. Quote, "If I live to be 100, maybe I'll be an anarchist," end quote. While this tongue-in-cheek prophecy never came to pass, he had indeed embarked on tangled political and personal journeys. Niemöller was always on his way, Karl Barth, the world-renowned Swiss theologian, said of the pastor's propensity for change. Martin Niemöller's persona never quite changed, but his causes, all of which he served selflessly and passionately, did change. His transformation from nationalist to internationalist, from militarist to pacifist, and from racist and anti-Semite to champion of equality, all evinced a more general transformation. From provincial, narrow-minded chauvinist to compassionate, open-minded humanitarian. In this, Niemöller is to be admired and his evolution celebrated. Committed as most of us are today to particular beliefs, we would do well to engage with the life of a man who changed his. By coming to terms with his past and dedicating his later life to the service of justice, peace, and love for one's neighbor, he inspires us to look at our own prejudices and to try to do better. Thank you very much. If anyone would like to get in touch with me after the question and answer period today with an email, either a comment or a question that you want, you can shoot me an email at the email address on the screen.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for that really eye-opening and really intriguing presentation. And I'll say, before reading your book and taking classes with you, I had heard the quote in different versions, and especially seeing it at the Holocaust Museum in DC. But it's really fascinating to hear just the complexity of Martin Niemöller. So thank you for this presentation.
My pleasure.
I'm just going to introduce myself again before we get into the Q&A. My name is Sophie Don. I'm the Senior Manager of Programs and Operations for the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation and a former student of Professor Hockenos at Skidmore. So I'll be leading our Q&A now. So if anybody does have a question, please feel free to put it into the Q&A, and we will take as many as we can. But I'm going to start us off with a couple of questions that we had wanted to ask as follow-up. So first off, can you talk a little bit about your interest in Niemöller as a character to study, and what led you to research him in particular?
Yeah, well, for a couple of decades now, at least, I've been interested in questions about the transition from a Nazi dictatorial authoritarian regime, and then the transition in 1945 and after to a democratic liberal government, at least in West Germany. Obviously, in East Germany, communism was imposed upon the population, but a transition took place from Nazism to more or less liberal democracy. It was not a transition that didn't have hiccups. Of course it did, and it was gradual and took time, but it was successful. I mean, West Germany became a country that the West could rely on in its democratic and liberal endeavors. And so my interest in that transition was, how complete was it? How genuine was it? And so I thought I would investigate a nationalist right of center institution, the German Protestant Church, and see how it navigated that transition from dictatorship and Nazism to liberal democracy. And a key player in that transition, one that helped it along, was Martin Niemöller. He, in fact, was the post-war leader of a faction within the post-war church that really insisted that the church come to terms with its Nazi past, that the church embrace the new democratic liberal regime, and that it acknowledge its guilt and repent openly. So he really represented sort of a faction that played a really significant role in helping this transition from Nazi dictatorship to liberal democracy. And I became sort of intrigued by him and how thorough his transition was as well. And as you note from the lecture, and as some people may have read in the book, it was a transition that was messy at times. It wasn't like 1945 and all of a sudden Niemöller is a liberal Democrat or anything like that. It was a transition that took time and was never really entirely 100% complete, but nevertheless, it was an impressive transformation, both by the church, which has become much more liberal and progressive even at times, and a transition by Niemöller. In that sense, Niemöller is somewhat unique, and he's interesting to investigate because not everybody in Germany made that transition as genuinely as he did. On the other hand, he also in some ways is a very ordinary German, as I say in the biography. Some people stand out in the Protestant church, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for his opposition and resistance. Niemöller was much more average in the sense, most Protestant pastors were conservative and voted for the far right parties, and were on some level supportive of Nazism. And so Niemöller kind of fits that characteristic. And so studying him is not just studying an individual, but this larger phenomenon.
Thank you. Now, I think we discussed this quite a bit during the talk, but I think it's a really interesting topic. We've heard about the transition of Niemöller from a supporter to a resistor, and also other characters like Bonhoeffer. And can you speak a little bit more to how the church more broadly navigated the Nazi rise to power?
Yeah, the answer to that is complicated, but I'll try to simplify it. As I noted in my lecture, there was clearly at least one split, if not multiple splits, within the church in its reaction to Nazism. So most of the Protestant church was enthusiastic when Hitler came to power. Not everybody, there were Bonhoeffers and other people like that, but most people thought, well, this nationalist movement will be good for the church, and perhaps we can ride along on its coattails and experience some rise in church membership and stuff like that by associating with the Nazis. So part of it was opportunistic. Other parts of it was that most of what the Nazis stood for, the German Protestant church stood for. The complication was when they began to talk about racial criteria for the church. That, of course, called into the question the Old Testament and the Jewish ancestry of Jesus. And so the church split between the German Christians, who I mentioned in the lecture, who were like the ardent pro-Nazis, anti-Jewish faction, and Niemöller, who really was just, in a sense, representing traditional Protestantism, where the Old Testament and the Jewish origins of Jesus were acknowledged, and that was a part of who the church was. So, but one further split I would just like to mention in terms of how they navigated it all was that within the group that became the confessing church, so the non-German Christians, they also split because a faction of them were far too conservative and traditionalist for Niemöller. And so as time went on, Niemöller began to represent sort of a wing, I don't want to say on the left because he wasn't a leftist, but there was a far right wing, a middle wing, and kind of a left wing, and Niemöller represented that other wing. And so it became impossible for the church to sort of function in any sort of united way. You had the German Christians and the more traditional conservatives, and then you had Niemöller and the confessing church. So it was a complicated story for sure. By the time the Nazi period ended, the church was still very divided, and it remained divided in the post-war period. In fact, the book that I write on the period 1945 to 1950 is called A Church Divided, German Protestants Confront the Nazi Past, in part because some of the divisions that appeared during the Nazi period continued after the Nazis were destroyed.
I think this actually leads really nicely into a question that we got from an audience member asking about if Niemöller, and I'm going to expand it to anybody, but did Niemöller or anybody speak out against Martin Luther's anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic writing?
Okay, very good question. And I can offer some thoughts about it. Not during the Nazi period. That probably isn't what you're referring to, but just to make clear, no, not at that point. But in the post-war period, Niemöller does. I think there was a TV interview that he was engaging in with a bunch of other religious people. I think it was in the 1960s. And he comes right out and talks about Martin Luther's anti-Semitism and how the Protestant church was trying to deal with that in the post-45 period. By making it a part of coming to terms with the Nazi past, also would require coming to terms with the deep-seated anti-Semitism that existed not just because of Martin Luther and Protestantism, but also because of just the long centuries of anti-Semitism within the Christian church. So it really was a lot to come to terms with, and it takes a long time to do that. But the church put out a number of statements along the way from 1945, the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, to up to the present, where they are condemning their former anti-Semitism and encouraging reconciliation and dialogue with Jews.
Thank you. We've used the term revisionist to describe this biography and biographical study. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and what other researchers have produced?
So the biographies that were written in the 20th century, so there was a biography that came out in 1956. Remember, Niemöller doesn't die until 1984. But a biography came out in 1956, and it was called God's Man. And that just gives you a sense of how he was treated. He was treated as, Saint Martin Niemöller. He was, again, like he was considered the face of the German resistance for much of the Nazi period among Americans. And so these books were just hagiographic, they were putting a halo on his head and treating him as if he was, a moral hero. And so that is sort of, in a way, part of what this Niemöller myth is all about. It was built through these newspaper articles and biographies that were written. But recently, there's been a spat of more critical, that is, revisionist material on Niemöller. So in 2017, a German published a biography of Niemöller in 2017. Mine came out in English in 2018. Another came out in German in 2019. And each one is beginning to be more critical of Niemöller. The 2017, a little less so, mine a little more so, 2019, even more so. So you can see there's sort of this building on one another's historical scholarship and arriving in a more critical revisionist position. Which I just think is a more honest position. It's not so much that anyone is bashing Niemöller. There's lots to be admired about him, but the fact remains that for the first half of his life, he was primarily dedicated to causes on the far right. After 1945, he transitions, as I've said, to more progressive, liberal. He becomes the voice for the needy and the downtrodden. And engages in social justice issues. And so I think that transition is as important to acknowledge as his Nazi past. And so these more critical revisionist biographies, I think, are sort of the norm now. And I think that's a good thing. I think we need to know the truth about Martin Niemöller, and I think we're getting to it.
But you said that, this had come out in 2018, so working on it a few years before that, leading up to it. If you were to write this now, like write your revisionist biography now, are there things that you would have done differently, or what's kind of your reflection on this project?
First of all, let me just say that writing a biography is kind of a daunting task. I felt a great burden of responsibility on my shoulders to try to get it right. I'm reading through this guy's personal materials, letters to children and wives and everything. You're just sort of digging into somebody's life. And all I could think of the whole time was, I hope no one does this to me. So I really felt pressure to be fair to him. And I think I was. Sometimes I think that perhaps I was too fair, and that today I would be even more critical. And that's primarily based on the fact that further research has been done since my biography came out. And some of that research has pointed to further issues with Niemöller's anti-Semitism. And so I think I would probably be a little more critical, but I would always want to try to balance my biography in such a way that it also pointed to this man's great contributions, especially in the post-45 period.
Your current research is on the use of the poem / quote by a range of organizations, whether that's museums, political groups, etc. Can you speak a little bit to how and when that started, the editorializing on this quote, which I'll put in quotes?
Yeah, the quote is so complicated because no one has ever found any proof that Niemöller invoked the quotation until it became, a quotation that everybody knew. So the scholars had thought for a long time that he had voiced the poetic version of the quotation in the late 40s, and yet we have not been able to find any archival or media proof of this. And so the quote has come in many forms, as you sort of indicate. I mean, at the Holocaust Museum, they list socialists, trade unionists, and Jews. More typically, the quote begins with communists. Thank you. In Boston, at the Boston Holocaust Memorial, they include Catholics. And then in sort of the 1960s, different groups and organizations, for example, the Black Panthers, invoked the quotation, but using their own groups that they felt were being oppressed by law enforcement. So the poem, I can't remember exactly what the Black Panthers included, but they included teachers, students, activists, and the Black Panthers themselves. Plenty plenty of people invoke the quote as what they think is verbatim, so you try to use the groups that they think were the groups that Niemöller used. But since there's no original quote by Niemöller, we don't really know what groups to include and what groups not to include. Mm-hmm. And so as you see on the screen now, these are just some examples of what we've seen. First they came for Black feminists, first they came for immigrants, first they came for tenure. These obviously reflect some of the things I read, but it's gotten really to the point where the quote has a life of its own. So no one anymore really thinks twice about putting whatever groups they want in it. There's quite a movement on the far right of political pundits, like he's not as popular today, but Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, Ann Coulter, Michael Savage, are just some of the people on the far right who've used the quote in putting their own groups in it. First they came for the gun owners, stuff like that. So it's really become a phenomenon, and I don't think there's any stopping it. People will just use it however they please at this point. And I think that that's nothing that we can do about.
Mm-hmm. So we have 2 questions from the audience that I do want to get to before we close our program. One is, would you be able to further contrast, I'm sure this is a very, very big question, but Bonhoeffer and Niemöller a little bit more?
Yeah, so Bonhoeffer was born in 1907. So he was about, I don't know, can't do the math really quick, but maybe 14 years younger than Niemöller. And in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, Bonhoeffer is immediately critical of Hitler and the Nazis. He knew from the start where he stood, and he stood that ground until he was executed. He had a relationship with Niemöller. I mean, Bonhoeffer was in Berlin and Niemöller was in Berlin-Dahlem, and they worked together. Niemöller's younger assistant was this guy, Franz Hildebrandt, who, by the way, was a pastor of Jewish descent. He had a Jewish parent. And so Niemöller, had an interesting relationship with sort of a more liberal, cosmopolitan Bonhoeffer and a assistant who had Jewish ancestry. They contrasted in the sense that Niemöller just was much more old school, much more traditionalist. He obviously had he thought that a lot of what the Nazis stood for were things that he and the Protestant church should stand for. So they got along in a sense as colleagues, but they were also kind of sometimes in conflict over how to handle all of this. Bonhoeffer actually went to England for about 2 years just to sort of get away from the situation in Germany. And Niemöller stayed around and founded, he did found the Pastors Mercy League with Bonhoeffer, but then Bonhoeffer left. So anyway, the relationship was amiable, but it had its conflicts.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then this last question, I'm not sure I know the answer to, is a compliment. First, your talk was fascinating. I'm wondering where you are currently teaching, as I'd like to take one of your courses. Do you have any, either courses or lectures or anything that would be available potentially for the public?
Sure. So I am the modern European historian at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. I teach a lot of classes on stuff that we just sort of were talking about today. I have a course called Resisting Hitler, a course on fascism. Right now I'm teaching a course called Cold War Berlin and another course called Revolution and Nationalism. I have not taught a course specifically on Martin Niemöller and the Protestant response to Nazism, just because I'm not so sure college students would be as fascinated by that as I am. I do have plenty of things that I've written, conference papers, articles, essays that I could share. There are online lectures that I've given that you can find. Certainly, whoever asked this question, feel free to email me and we could have a quick little dialogue about what you might want to pursue.
Thank you so much. So in the interest of time, because we are now at just about 7 o'clock, we're going to end here. But if anyone has any follow-up questions or thoughts, you can see Professor Hockenos' email up on the screen. My email, which is sdon@philholocaustmemorial.org, is in all of your Zoom confirmations, so you do have access to that. And I am happy to also pass along any questions to Professor Hockenos. But thank you all again for being here today. And thank you so much to Professor Hockenos for sharing your expertise with us and answering all these questions. I think this has been really, really amazing, really fascinating.
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.